My name is Paul Thomas. I'm the president of a full-service valuation firm in Kiev, Ukraine, named IRE Ukraine LLC. We also have a second company named Thomas and Simonova, after the two partners. I have been very active in business in Ukraine in a variety of ways for 23 years now. Let's start at the beginning. Ukraine created a privatization process, and the process it creates some of the problems with privatization itself. Not surprisingly, the system they put into place. At independence, every state enterprise was, of course, wholly owned by the government. So the first step is the government had to corporatize, to use the term, corporatize these companies, which meant they had to write corporate statutes. They had to identify all of the assets. And for some of these companies, this could be 100,000 assets, buildings, machinery, equipment, factories, you name it, infrastructure. They had to identify all of that, incorporate all of this information into inventory and accounting records. They had to set up a proper accounting system. And they had to, of course, value these assets for the statute fund, charter fund, if you will. That process, if it was done with some inaccuracies, that process then created problems down the road. Once it's corporatized, now you have equity. Now it's still a 100% government-owned company, but the equity now consists of X number of shares. The next step is the government would say, okay, we have a plan for privatization in general. I'm going to use the word plan, not strategy. We have a plan for privatization in general. And so for a particular company, they might sell 100% of the shares, rarely. Typically, they would chop them up into various share packages, 25% or 50% or 75%. And then they would take a decision over what period of time to sell these shares. They might sell a 25% share package. They might sell a second 25% share package. Some years later, a third 25% share package. So that very quickly, you had a complex situation where you had some companies that were corporatized. Okay, so I'm going to use the word company now, not state enterprise, but company. So you had companies that were 100% owned by the government, and then you had companies that were some percentage, minority, majority, and there you go. Now, when the government would take a particular company and say, okay, we're going to chop this up into, for example, 4 25% share packages, and we're going to sell them, one at a time over a number of years. The problem is, who wants to buy a 25% share package and then have the Ukrainian government as the veto-proof majority owner? Well, pretty much nobody. Not serious companies, not serious investors. This was kind of a problem. So you ended up with individuals buying these share packages who tended to be either Ukrainian or Russian individuals or companies, either because they themselves could, shall we say, navigate the political winds, or they would be an intermediary, a trader in effect, buy the package and then sell it on to somebody else. Buy it very, very cheap, either because it was worth a very small value, because so many of these Ukrainian state enterprises, companies, really have no value. They're technologically obsolete. They're uncompetitive. So they would buy them very, very cheap for that reason, or they would buy them cheap because of political influence and certain other relationships, and then they would sell them on to someone who had an intention to operate the company and make their profit that way. So the government from the beginning had a flawed process. Now, if you fast forward to today, I have a couple of statistics, numbers. Sorry, I'm going to throw out a couple of numbers. I got to look at them here. Because we got to put this in perspective. The thing we have to remember about Ukraine is a very large country with a large population and a very large, complex economy. There's been 11,000 companies created as joint stock companies by the government of Ukraine. Now, 11,000 of them. That's a large number. That's a huge task. Now, the State Property Fund has on a list to be sold 1,297 companies. And for the 2017-2018 budgetary year, they have added an additional 300 companies to be privatized. If you look over the entire 26 years, they have raised through privatization sale, and I'm going to emphasize sale because there's other sources of revenue here. So through privatization sale, they've raised 64 billion hryvnias. You can't really put that into dollars because the exchange rate of the hryvnia has changed from 2 to the dollar to 26 to the dollar. So, but to give you an idea, one single privatization sale, the sale of the Kirovostal steel mill, that sale alone represents 40% of all the money they have raised in 26 years. So privatization in general, it is fair to say, has been basically a failure, because that's not very much privatization of companies, and that's not very much money for an entire 26-year period, especially when one sale alone is about 40%. Now, the State Property Fund, this is important to stress as well. They do not exist just to sell assets. They also, there's two kinds of companies. There's those that can be sold, and then there are those that the government has declared to be strategic assets of the nation that cannot be sold. Obvious things like the National Gas Company, NOC, or the company that owns all of the gas transportation pipelines in Ukraine, nuclear power station. So there are assets that will never be sold. And then on that list, of course, there are some assets that could be sold and should be sold, but they tend to be very profitable or very important in a regional sense, and so the government just wishes to retain ownership of them. Why? Because there's two other sources of revenue here. One are dividends that these companies, whether they're wholly or partially state-owned, or and I emphasize this, whether they're wholly or partially state-owned, these companies have to pay dividends to the Ukrainian government. So this makes them a very important source of revenue. Secondly, the State Property Fund doesn't just own companies. They own uncounted thousands of objects, a building, a warehouse, and this tends to be exclusively administrative, commercial real estate, which they will rent for money. So you have those three sources of income: sales, dividends, and rent. And therein lies the rub, because it is fair to say that the Ukrainian government has never crafted a privatization strategy. If by strategy you mean how can we privatize certain assets, certain companies, in a way that creates a net benefit for the entire Ukrainian economy, in a way that stimulates the creation of new business enterprises, or maintains or stimulates employment. The State Property Fund has existed and continues to exist for one reason, and that is to raise money for the national budget. Raise money for the national budget on an annual basis. This is why the issue of dividends through retaining certain ownership is important, because that money goes to the budget. This is why maintaining ownership of assets that are being rented is very important, because that money goes to the budget. And the privatization sales are important, but they tend to be relatively erratic. So there's no concept of leverage here, of using the state property fund to leverage the development of the country, leverage economic growth, business formation, capital investment. It's all about getting money today for the budget. And they've been, well, spectacularly unsuccessful, we could say. In 2016, the Rada set a target for the State Property Fund to raise 17.1. You always have to be suspicious of any number that has a decimal after it, a budget number. So they set the target and said, State Property Fund, you have to raise, just from sales, not dividends, not rent, just from sales, 17.1 billion hryvnias in 2016. The State Property Fund achieved 1% of that target. Something like 192 million hryvnias, something like that. But it was literally 1% of the target. Now, so what did the government do? In 2017, they turned around for this year's budget and they said, okay, we want the State Property Fund to raise, through privatization sales, 17.1 billion hryvnias, the exact identical number. And of course, they're not going to come anywhere near that. They'll be lucky to get another 1 or 2 or 3% of that. So the government really desperately does need to rethink what is the purpose of State Property Fund and how it should operate, and what are they trying to do with privatization. First of all, so many of these companies simply are not worth buying. I have valued hundreds of companies in Ukraine for different purposes, international audits with big four firms, or for investment or restructuring, or for debt financing, or for privatization, for many reasons. And so many of these companies, especially the industrial companies, manufacturing companies, they are using very old technology, sometimes 60, 70 years old technology. So they, for example, consume, Ukrainian industrial capacity is way above the national average, the world average, in how much energy it consumes per unit of output, whether you measure that as energy consumption in all forms per unit of GDP, or energy consumption at a particular chemical factory, steel mill, in terms of a ton of product produced, or in terms of as a percentage of revenue. So they're very inefficient in that sense. The largest companies, which is what people are interested in, that 11,000 companies I mentioned, by the way, those are mostly big companies. This is why Ukraine is kind of locked into a position where they primarily produce low value-added products, whether it's in the metallurgical sector, the manufacturing sector, agriculture. Okay, you can sell bulk wheat and corn, but that's the lowest stage of value-added. So they're locked into that low value-added stage. Now, in order to break out of this, Ukraine is just full of smart people. Everybody knows that. But to break out of that cycle, you have to have investment, and investment on a very large scale, and you have to have a legal system that will protect investments, protect ownership. And Ukraine doesn't do very well on the legal side of the ledger in terms of protecting investments, protecting minority shareholder rights. This has always been a problem. So what often happens is a company will be purchased and then just cannibalized, liquidated by the owner. And yes, you mentioned that word oligarch. That word has taken on a bit of a pejorative meaning nowadays. But oligarchy simply means that in an economic and political sense, you have a relatively small number of individuals or entities that effectively control most of the political and economic power of a nation. But here's something that almost never gets focused on enough. Where did these oligarchs come from? Okay, these guys weren't born wealthy. They didn't inherit wealth from their parents like the Walmart family. They didn't just parachute in from the sky. All of these oligarchs were Ukrainian citizens, and they were all, most of them, if not all of them, were made wealthy by the privatization process itself. Okay, these were smart people, ambitious people, well-connected people, and they tended to be the individuals and later their holding companies that would buy these share packages, buy these companies. And because the privatization process was never sufficiently, it's getting better. It's getting much better, but historically it was completely opaque, and the to whom they would sell and how they would sell and the prices they would sell. This would often be determined in advance, and nobody really could transparently see what is going on in there, and so the privatization system itself created all of these oligarchs, and if you look at who they are primarily their wealth is primarily based in the energy and industrial sector, and they didn't build those power stations, they didn't build those oblenergos, these energy distribution stations, for example. They didn't build the steel mills. They purchased them from the government, and for lots and lots of reasons, including economic reasons, they purchase them at very low prices. So that's kind of how we got where we are today. Now, in defense of some of these companies, individuals, they have made extremely large investments cumulatively into a lot of these sectors, but especially in metallurgy and manufacturing. They have made large investments. But, if you're a Ukrainian citizen who has political and economic wealth and power, it's easier for you, it's less risky, the risk profile for you to make, for example, $100 million investment in a steel mill, which is a relatively small number for a steel mill. But to make that investment, it's less risky for you than it would be for a foreign company, because the foreign company doesn't have the kind of influence politically that you do. And so in that sense, the political process, the judicial process becomes an exorbitantly high risk factor for, say, a foreign company, but not necessarily for a well-established Ukrainian company. Obviously, if you are a government or an entity like the World Bank, EBRD, the IMF, or the EU, or particularly countries like the United States or Germany, you obviously have a great influence. But I'm going to take that back. You have influence, and you have it to the extent that you wish to pursue it. But whether you're a bank or a government, you pursue interest that is also in your interest. And, it's in everybody's interest for Ukraine to continue to develop, which it is, to continue a process of reform economically, politically, judicially, which they are. And it's in everybody's interest. But, ultimately this all falls to those in power in Ukraine. Now, having said that, I don't want to give the impression that, if if the president of Ukraine would just wake up today and say, I'm going to, reform this country so it looks like Britain. Well, we don't want to fall into the trap of naivete. I often hear from diplomats, academics in America that, well, Ukraine needs to privatize everything immediately. I mean, literally that statement. Well, the process I've been describing to you, you can see it's really quite difficult. to sometimes it's impossible. And here's another fundamental issue. The structure of the Ukrainian government that they inherited at independence was the structure created by the Soviet Union, which meant that every function of government, every ministry, for example, was a vertical entity, from the bottom to the top, and at the top was whoever was at the top at the time. So these ministries are designed, as all ministries are, to be vertical. The difference is, if you go to a country like the United States, yes, we have vertical ministries, but our system, like many other countries, is designed with horizontal linkages between ministries, so that various ministries can work together on national policies that require the input of various ministries. And in Ukraine, that effectively doesn't exist. There's no sort of legal, regulatory, bureaucratically structured system by which, the state property fund can work directly with another ministry or two or three ministries in order to craft a strategy in order to do something. So a lot of these problems, come from they're built-in structural, built-in systemic problems. And until those are changed, but it's very, very difficult, to change big systemic issues like that. But that's holding back. So even if the Ukrainian government says we're going to, change the way the state property fund operates, we're going to stop having them be just a cash cow for the annual budget, and we're going to have them meet this and this and this strategic goal. Well, it would be very difficult for them to do that unless they first created a bureaucratic regulatory system by which a variety of ministries could work together, and they don't have that. Your description of sort of how particular individuals and their corporate entities were able to amass wealth through the privatization process, it's accurate, and it's well known. Nobody denies that. But that is, I'm happy to say, that is more of a thing of the past than it is of the present. As far as transparency in general, absolutely yes. And by the way, every country struggles with transparency. And Ukraine, of course, struggles mightily with transparency. And there's a legitimate commitment by a lot of folks in government, outside of government, especially in civil society, but also individuals within the legislative or executive branch. There is a commitment to increasing transparency. And yes, obviously, the more transparent the process, the better. For example, the one great success, if you want to look at an individual privatization, the one great success story was the sale of the Kirovostal of Kirovostal, a gigantic steel mill that was ultimately bought by ArcelorMittal, Indian-French conglomerate, one of the largest, if not the largest in the world. And that was done through an open auction. That was just an open auction. And here's the key point. It wasn't just like anybody could just come in and bid. There were criteria set for the bidders, so I couldn't just personally go bid. All right, so there were criteria set for the bidders, and there were criteria governing the sale and the sales agreement and the implementation, and that was known transparently, and the process was done in what in a way that you could say ultimately was successful. They sold that steel mill based on the exchange rate of the time for somewhere between $4 and $5 billion. I don't remember the exact number, but that is a lot of money. That is, that's about, as I told earlier, about 40% of all the money they've ever raised. The problem that exists with privatization today, a couple things. You still have the setting of criteria for who can bid, and not just we can broaden this discussion from the state property fund to the whole procurement system of the Ukrainian government. So whether you're trying to sell something to the government or whether you're trying to buy something from state property fund, there's often criteria that are set, and very often these criteria kind of raise eyebrows. They tend, in an uncomfortably large number of cases, to be written with a particular person or a particular company or a particular result in mind. So that's still a difficult process. That's still you have transparency. Yeah, I can see transparently what all the requirements are, but those requirements are not creating the largest possible pool of qualified bidders. They are actually creating a very small pool of qualified bidders, some of which are there because they have made deals outside of the privatization process or procurement process. They represent who the government wants to sell to or buy from. That's still a bit of a difficulty. Okay, and again, you see this not just in privatization, but you see this has become a rather big problem in procurement using this Prozoro system, online procurement. It'll be online procurement to, for example, the government will hire, for example, a firm to do certain very high-level technical work for the government, engineering or financial or economic or whatever, and the requirements will be written in a way that it's for those of us who know a particular sector of the economy. You read the requirements and you say, yes, they're transparent. And they're transparently written to hire this particular company. So that remains a problem. So transparency in and of itself is great. Let's say it this way. Transparency is a necessary but far from sufficient condition to ensure that procurement or the state property fund selling of assets, it's necessary but not sufficient to ensure that it's going to be done the right way and in a way that represents the most profitable, shall we say, win-win for everyone involved. Most importantly, the Ukrainian economy. The single greatest success of privatization was something that happened a long time ago. When Ukraine first became independent, the very first thing that they did in terms of privatization was what they called mass privatization of residential properties. So because, on independence, everybody, whether you are a member of the Rada, whether you're a farm worker, it doesn't matter, rich, poor, doesn't matter. Everybody was living in an apartment or they had a dacha or they're living in a house that they did not own. Now, they had maybe been living there for 3 generations sometimes, but they didn't own it. It was owned by the government. So the government went through a process of mass privatization so that every legally registered occupant of a property, not land, of a property, was able to take ownership of that for free. There were some administrative fees, which there always are to do stuff, but nobody had to buy it. They didn't put a market value on a flat and make you buy it. They just gave it to you if you were the legally registered occupant. Now, that was so fundamentally successful because for many years in Ukraine, all the way until the last maybe 5 years or so, for many years in Ukraine, there was a fear, a legitimate fear, that, well, certain political parties like the Communist Party under Mr. Simonova, they will take power and we're going to go back to communism. Politically, we're going to go back to a pure administrative economy. Well, no, you're not. Because it's a little hard to go back to communism when everybody in Ukraine, including a lot of very powerful people in Ukraine, own their own residential property. They have a home. You can't kick them out of their home. One of the best ways that authoritarian states can control people is to say, well, you have to think what I want you to think and you have to do what I want you to do, or otherwise you'll lose your job and you can't live in that apartment anymore because I own it, you don't. So once that foundation was put into place, that's the foundation upon which Ukraine has been slowly, steadily, with fits and starts, building a market economy and building democracy. But it ultimately, started with that great success of giving people ownership of a place to live. The greatest failure, let's now jump from the early 90s till today. The greatest failure is right now the Zaporizhia Aluminum Industrial Complex, because this was an enterprise, an extremely large enterprise, employed 6,000 people, very important to the local economy of Zaporizhia. 6,000 workers could represent, let's just use round numbers, that could represent the income of 25,000 people, say, throwing in family members. And of course, there's a big economic multiplier there for small businesses and et cetera, and et cetera, et cetera. That aluminum complex was very profitable. It was producing, we've actually valued that complex on two different occasions. Most recently, we valued it just like now for privatization. But it was operating for a few years recently, 2008, 9, 10. It was operating to close to full capacity, and it was very profitable. And today it is completely dead, well, it's kind of a long, complicated story, but it is completely dead. And instead of an aluminum complex that could be sold for, I'm not going to use actual numbers, it could be sold for a very large price. Think of aluminum complexes, right? But instead of being an enterprise that could be sold for a very large price, it is an enterprise that can be sold only for a very small amount of money, and it will never produce aluminum again. It only employs today about 200 people. The vast majority of the industrial capacity, industrial assets, will be simply liquidated, and that obviously is not good for anybody, not the national government, not the municipal oblast government of Zaporizhia, not for people who like to have jobs. So that's a big failure, and it's a failure of primarily politics. It's primarily a political failure, not an economic failure. When it comes to privatization, the government of Ukraine needs to first set a goal. You can't have a strategy without a goal. And someone might say, well, the goal is to raise as much money as we can for the national budget. That's not much of a goal, okay? If you ask me, okay, that's a goal. Let's use the state property fund to collect dividends, collect rent. Let's occasionally sell some stuff, usually at a fraction of what it could potentially be worth to raise money for the government. That's not a goal. That's a survival strategy. Okay, that's like, borrowing paycheck to paycheck. A strategy would look something like this. What assets, I'm going to use the word assets, not companies, because remember, a company is just an agglomeration of assets. So when the government sat down and said, okay, we're going to create this company and we're going to give this company a name through the corporatization process, they chose what assets to put in there. And they didn't have to create one company. They could have created 2 or 3 or 4 companies. Okay, so a company is just an accumulation of assets. So the government should back away from the concept of companies and start looking at the concept of assets. What productive assets does the Ukrainian government currently own, partially or in total? How can we privatize these assets in a way that increases the GDP, in a way that increases business formation, especially small and medium-sized businesses that are supporting, if this is a larger package of assets like an aluminum complex, let's do this in a way that will stimulate business creation, small, medium, that is part of the big economic multiplier built around that large conglomeration of assets. Let's do this in a way that increases, not decreases, employment. I mean, privatization has been to use the American phrase, privatization has been a job killer. Okay, and sometimes that's inevitable, because if you have a dead old Soviet enterprise, nobody's going to bring it back to life. But in a lot of cases, and like in Zaporizhia, I think is a good example, there's no reason that entity should go from 6,000 jobs to 200. You're not going to get back to 6,000. There was too much, inefficiency in there. But there's certainly no reason it should be as low as 200. If you do the privatization in a smart way, you can create any number of medium-sized enterprises using those assets that will generate income, generate jobs, and stimulate the economy. But that kind of a strategy doesn't exist. The question is not asked, how can we privatize assets in order to do those things that I just said, stimulate the economy, job formation, business formation. The question that's always asked is, how much money can we get from the state how much money can we get from privatization today? And that, to me, that's a tactic. That's not a strategy. So the first thing the government needs to do is create a strategy. But again, we're coming back now to one of these fundamental problems. To create a strategy is one thing. To implement the strategy requires the cooperation of various ministries with various responsibilities and various expertises. It also requires cooperation. That's sort of in a shall we say, administrative, executive branch of government function, and the structures to do that don't really exist. And secondly, it requires the national government to cooperate with government at the municipal level, and there isn't very much of that kind of cooperation either. There isn't sort of a history. There aren't really the processes and the procedures that allow that to happen. So, even if they crafted before they crafted a privatization strategy, they would need to craft a strategy to create the political, administrative environment in which a privatization strategy could be successfully implemented. So it's a very, very complex issue. In every country, the government always has the potential to create more obstacles and problems, then they have the potential to create good things. A government action more times than not tends to create more problems than it solves. A law of unintended consequences. That's just kind of a fact of government. If we break this down, I do not see much possibility for the Ukrainian government to, at this stage, create a privatization strategy with the kind of goals I described. That's kind of a Herculean task, not only to craft it and get all the different folks on board to agree to that strategy, but then in order to literally create the kind of legal, bureaucratic, horizontal cooperation necessary to do that. I'm not optimistic that we're going to see that. However, the government is becoming more transparent in the privatization process. The obvious incidences of writing requirements for a privatization that pretty much guarantee who's going to buy it, there's a lot less of that. So they're becoming much better in that. They're doing better valuations. They're setting better criteria. They're having more transparent sales process. But that alone, all that's going to do is further the tactic, if you will, of raising more money for the Ukrainian budget. And again, once you sell something, I mean, unless the government, like they did with Zaporizhia Aluminum Complex, unless the government goes back and just renationalizes the ownership, you only get to sell it once, except in rare cases like Zaporizhia. You only get to sell it once. If you just sell it for the sole purpose of raising money, the probability that sale of that asset, that company, is going to achieve any long-term goals, economic goals, business formation, employment, it's very, very low. It's just sort of a hit and a miss. And when you look back over the history of privatization, you see two things. Again, they occur less today, but the cumulative effect has still been quite terrible. So many assets have been sold and simply liquidated. So many, asset packages, agglomerated into a company, and then the shares are sold. So many of these companies, so many of these assets have been bought and just simply liquidated, and for a variety of reasons, bad and good. Defensible and indefensible economic reasons why they've been liquidated. And in my own opinion, a lot of that liquidation or cannibalization was unnecessary. Those assets, and especially packages of productive assets, under the right ownership, under the right, under the right ownership, operating within a better legal system that would protect investments and ownership, a lot of those companies would be operating today rather than just having been liquidated. And then the second thing is that you had, and again, much less today, but you have a situation where a share package was purchased by an individual or a company that had no intention of actually operating the company. They were just using their political connections to buy cheap so they could turn around and sell it to the company that would operate it at a much higher price. So which raises the obvious question, well, if you're going to, I'll make up numbers, if some guy's going to buy a an aluminum complex for $1 and turn around and sell it for $5, why didn't the government of Ukraine sell it for $5? So, again, this doesn't happen as much today, but cumulatively this has been a big problem. So there's a lot of water under the bridge that you can't get back. The last comment I'd make there is, I believe the Ukrainian government should stop selling shares, stop selling share packages. Goodness, I've been saying this for 23 years, and obviously nobody listens. You cannot sell companies the way you sell potatoes. If you're selling shares, Zaporizhia is a classic example. Without going into all the details, but, fine, let's give a shameless plug and say, go to Vox Ukraine, read my article. If you sell the gigantic complex of assets called Zaporizhia Aluminum Complex, and if you sell that as equity, shares of ownership in a corporate entity, the company is worth nothing, zero, precisely zero, because the debts of the company greatly exceed any revenue, any asset value. Okay, we forget that if you buy a company, you're not just buying assets, you're also buying liabilities. You're buying the balance sheet of that company. And if you look at that balance sheet and you see billions of hryvnias of debt and millions of hryvnias of assets, well, by definition, the company's worth precisely zero. The equity in the company's worth precisely zero. That does not mean the underlying income generating potential of all those assets is zero. Not at all. Okay? It just means that, those valuable assets are part of a failed corporate entity. And then if you sell the failed corporate entity, it's going to be worth zero. Okay, so you find a way to put some small positive price on there. But if the government would stop doing something like that and instead stand back and say, okay, what are the assets we actually own? What can they do? Either operating in a large package or perhaps operating in a number of sub-packages. Zaporizhia's aluminum is a classic case. You could chop up those asset packages to form the basis of any number of medium-sized enterprises. And if you sold just the assets, you could sell them for their income-generating capacity that competent appraisers can put a value on. Okay, that's one of the three methods by which assets are valued. It's called the income approach. But if you rather than selling asset packages designed to get a maximum price based on the income generating potential of these packages, you just instead sell pieces of paper. You sell shares in a company, and then you look at the company and the company's worth zero. Well, there you have it. You have an utterly failed privatization precisely because you have structured your approach to privatization in a way designed to guarantee failure. And that needs to change. And there may be some hope for the government to switch and start doing what I would advocate for them to do. I live in Ukraine. I'm invested in Ukraine. I have companies in Ukraine. I have a home in Ukraine. So Ukraine is my home. I also have a home here in America. But more importantly, we tend to overlook something. A country changes because it wants to change. And a country is just an agglomeration of its people, okay? I mean, when we talk about the government, well, anybody's government is just people acting together collectively. If we talk about a nation is just an accumulation of all the people and everything they're doing. The reason Ukraine is making substantial progress, and they are, Okay, everybody who cares will say, not enough, not fast enough. Okay, well, fine. Let's keep saying that because, you got to keep pushing on yourself and everybody else. But Ukraine will not change because an American guy gives good advice or the IMF puts a lot of terms and conditions on a loan to stabilize the currency. They will change. Ukraine will change because the people of Ukraine demand change. And the biggest cultural psychological shift that's occurred in Ukraine the last few years is that we've gone beyond the proverbial tipping point. A large majority of Ukrainians now demand reform. They demand change. They demand improvement. And you can see this in the empowerment of a lot of civil society. You can see this success in some pushback by the government. Governments don't like to be told what to do. So, the government does push back against, civil society. They do push back against the media. But that's just an indication that civil society is having a lot of effect. And so for that most fundamental reason, we have to be, not naively, eyes wide open, cynically optimistic, okay, for Ukraine, because this country today is not what it was 5 years ago. So anyway, to answer your question, yeah, I'll always give my advice. But, I hope they listen to me less and they listen to Ukrainians more. If you look at the top 23, you can go to the website of the State Property Fund, find this in Ukrainian and in English. I printed it off here. The top 23 companies for privatization, and most of them are in the energy or industrial sector. Mostly these are oblenergos, but this is interesting. A lot of these oblenergos, the electricity distribution, okay? But again, here's the problem. They're selling minority share packages. And every one of these oblenergos in which they're trying to sell a minority share package is owned by a particular individual who is a very wealthy and powerful guy. And one must ask the rhetorical question, do I want to be a minority shareholder in a company owned by a very powerful and wealthy Ukrainian oligarch? Well, that's a big risk. So obviously, because, minority shareholder rights, I probably will have some judges or people yelling at me, but minority shareholder rights are not as well protected in Ukraine as they should be. Better than they used to, but not sufficient, okay? And so what will almost certainly happen, in fact, what I know is happening, is that the share packages, these minority share packages, 22 for 25% or 30% or whatever, they're going to be bought by the current owner. Well, and they can be bought transparently by the current owner. They can be bought for a fair market value, which they will be by the current owner. But there's not going to be any competition for the purchase of those share packages, for the reason that you're going to be a minority shareholder in a electricity distribution company owned by somebody that you may not want as a majority partner. So that's a bit of a problem. There's a couple of there's a chemical plant here, and there's a couple of large chemical plants, things like that. But it's sort of more of the same. I would like to turn the question around and say, look, in a way, there's too much attention paid to privatization. Again, I hear this comment, well, the Ukrainian government needs to privatize everything immediately. As if they did that, then we'd all wake up and be as wealthy as Germany. The State Property Fund can only sell or rent or collect dividends from that which it owns. And everything it owns, it inherited from the Soviet Union. So it owns a lot of old, uncompetitive, inefficient stuff. If the government's a majority owner, they're not going to be the most innovative owner and operator. They're not going to make the largest investments, take the largest business risk. That's not what governments do. They're more caretakers than innovators. Okay, there isn't a lot of entrepreneurial spirit in government anywhere. Now, and even though you have several of these large holding companies that are innovative, that do make investments, they're still doing that with, shall we say, old industries, chemical, metallurgical, old infrastructural assets, electricity distribution. So I would end by saying, let's take the focus off of privatization of things that already exist and look at Ukraine's potential to create new things. And this is where I believe it gets exciting. No country is going to prosper in the 21st century, or at least no country is going to achieve its maximum economic potential in the 21st century if they're not part of, preferably one of the leaders of, one of these new 21st century industries. Robotics, IT, AI, all the biological sciences, biotechnology, etc. And Ukraine certainly has demonstrable, and by demonstrable I mean they produce products and sell them for money, demonstrable expertise in biotechnology, particularly in bio-nanotechnology, and particularly in bio-nanotechnology based upon the production of pure organic elements, okay, and in organic form, and various other types of biotechnology. This is the obvious complement to Ukraine's well-recognized comparative even, advantage in agriculture and in agribusiness. They have the scientific base in all of the agra areas, if you will, all the bio areas that can complement their very large, fundamental, highly fecund and productive agricultural sector. And in so doing, they can move away from just selling low value added wheat and corn and soy and move way up the value added chain. And Ukraine also has proven as in they produce stuff and sell it for money, proven 21st century capabilities in all the aerospace industries. And there's others, but I'm most excited about their scientific and production commercial capabilities in all things bio. They have the human capital base. And to date, they've only recognized a tiny percentage of the potential. So I would hope that the government would spend a lot of serious time thinking about how to create strategies, not just to sell old stuff that they inherited, but to create strategies that will allow them to develop entirely new 21st century industries. They have the human capital. They have the natural scale economies. They have a perfect geographical position for a lot of things. And so I would hope they would look at that issue. What can we as a government do to stimulate the growth and development of new 21st century industries, several of which, like all things bio, in which we have an obvious advantage, in which we are clearly one of the top 10 countries scientifically and in this area. This is what I would hope they would do. But again, that's real strategy, because that's looking at the future. And the single, and I guess I'll end here, the single most important thing the government has got to do if they want to pursue that kind of a strategy is they have to radically, fundamentally reform the entire judicial prosecutorial system to bring down the risk of doing any kind of business in or with Ukraine. That's the single most important thing they should be doing, is reforming the judicial prosecutorial system and focusing on the future. No, it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed discussing this. I'm going to make an utterly non-patronizing comment. Ukraine has a very, very bright future. They like every country, we're our own worst enemies. But they certainly do have a future. I just hope they get there a lot faster and a lot more successfully than they have been. Take care. I got to run too. All right. Bye.